So I don't see the paperless office behind you. That looks quite commendable.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the second of our Google Hangouts on this contract management MOOC. Delighted that you're all joining us today, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce our experts with us today as well. I'm Sally Hughes, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of IACCM, so I'm going to be hosting this Google Hangout today and posing questions. I'm very keen to get you all who are listening live to pose questions while we're chatting. It's supposed to be a very interactive session. You can pose questions to us all three ways. One, via the comments section of the step. Two is live in the YouTube chat. And the third way is by Twitter using the hashtag FLContracts. So our topic today is agile and collaborative contracts. Our experts are, to my right, CEO of IACCM, Tim Cummins, and joining us from the US, Paul Branch, who is the Head of Contract and Commercial Management at BT. So welcome both of you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So Tim, I'm going to start with you. Agile contracting is somewhat of an oxymoron, I might suggest. Generally, we go forward with contracting with a desire for certainty, and very much of the training that we're given around our contracting expertise is to create certainty. I think we would say that contracts have got longer and longer and longer over the years because of that very fact. But there's a real push now for agility in contracting. So how do we reconcile those differences?
Sure. So I think it's firstly, you mentioned two contrasting points there in a way, because on one hand you were talking about the agile contract, and then you were talking about agile contracting. And I think we do need to distinguish those two, and both are very important.
Yeah.
Let's start, if we may, with the agile contract. So agile contract is indeed a model of contracting which is designed to deal with levels of uncertainty, and predominantly used, as you well know, originally in the software industry, where there has been a traditional difficulty in good reconciliation between the potential of the software versus the requirements of the customer or end user. Agile contracts are trying to deal with that level of uncertainty. So in environments where you frequently, where you may know what you want to achieve, but you're not sure how you're going to achieve it. And traditional forms of contract, with their rigidity, with their time and materials, created this open-ended environment. In a way, the agile component is almost depicted a great statement that the CEO of Microsoft made a few months ago. We have to increase our speed to failure. Now, I'm sure his goal in life and his ambition for Microsoft is not to fail. His point was that in an environment of such uncertainty, we're having to do innovative and challenging things, and we don't always know whether we can do them, but if we don't try, we'll never find out. So agile contracts are often designed more to create phases of activity, milestones in activity, so there's a rigorous and consistent pattern of review. If you don't meet an objective, you make a decision. Do we want to go on or don't we want to go on? Do we need to renegotiate? So the contract design is a much more flexible one. It isn't so much about changing a lot of the underpinning terms and conditions and principles. It's much more about the structure of milestones and building in a much better governance system. Now, it may also include very specific terms around things like joint working, for example, is usually a component of agile contracts. Moving to agile contracting, we're talking about the process. And that's usually in the context of a broader corporate or organizational goal to try to be more flexible and faster in the operations of the business. And it's in that context, of course, I think you also are talking when probably the typical reputation of the contracting process is not one of speed.
Yeah.
So there we have a different challenge, which is how do we redesign contracting processes so that they are faster and more nimble and more flexible. And there we have to challenge ourselves to move away from a control and compliance driven mentality, not to say that we become grossly irresponsible, but we really have to think about how we get a better balance between the traditional control and compliance role of a contract and contracting process versus that need for speed.
And of course, Tim, it's not just the traditional legal approach to contracting, which, as you rightly say, is very much driven by control and compliance. It's a fixed contract, fixed terms, fixed price for a fixed period of time to achieve a fixed outcome, a desired outcome. That's our sort of traditional approach. It's very often the finance department that is very nervous about Agile, the concept of Agile contracting, because they would argue that there's uncertainty built into that sort of contract on the basis that actually there is no defined price. We don't know what we're going to be paying for this at the end because it's Agile. How do you, what response would you give to the finance department in these situations?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it often goes beyond finance. It often goes back to the executives who said they wanted to be agile in the first place. Once they begin to realize the impact that may have, things like revenue recognition, and certainly for finance, as you say, the whole budgeting process can be very, very, very difficult to manage in that agile environment. And people are still, to be honest, wrestling with that. But again, that was more to the agile contract than the agile process. So I think the opportunity for those responsible for any aspect of contracting process to think about more agile design is tremendous. And of course, we touched on that in a way with last week's Hangout. We were looking at digital technologies, which really can be transformational, I think, in the level of insight that you can gain, and therefore the extent to which you can be more proactive, the ways you can streamline review and approval processes, all of those sorts of things. And I think next week we're going to talk more about the contracting standards, which will be another mechanism to drive this greater agility. But within the context of individual contracts, I agree, it's challenging. Probably a good question to throw at Paul, because
absolutely,
I suspect it's one that he has to tackle.
Absolutely, Tim. Yeah, particularly, I think it's driven more by how the markets are evolving and the demand for the sort of services that we supply is changing. So a lot of our services are moving into the cloud, and that creates an opportunity for services to be delivered in real time, amended in real time, procured in real time even. So that demands a different approach to contracting. And Agile fits right into that, and how we can then use the technology to ensure that we protect the organization with effective governance, yet to your point, don't get too wrapped up in how the minutiae of how that governance actually operates. So that's a good balance. And certainly in BT, we've applied some technology. Artificial intelligence around natural language is one example. And how we're using principled contracting approaches to basically drive out a lot of the previous energy that some would say waste on the standard terms, and really focus on the value add pieces of the proposition that are those agile components. So, for example, we can use AI to pull out, identify what some of our standard provisions are, and maybe augment or even replace some of the more complex analysis that goes on into understanding contract form, so that we can start moving towards auto approval, and maybe not even coming to the table to negotiate, some of the more traditional things, limitation of liability, because they're a principle that's been agreed for a particular product set or in a particular sector. So technology has a real role to play in all of that, I think. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And there's a question here, Paul, and I wonder whether or not I might actually pose this to you, which is, what risks should a contract manager be aware of when negotiating an agile contract? And when you think about your experiences, and obviously you touched on the sort of technology that you've implemented and so on, what's your experience in that?
Certainly, it does bring a different risk profile because, as you mentioned yourselves, there is a lack of certainty around on the sell side around the total value of the contract that you're letting, but that can be a plus too, in that if you design the agile contract correctly, it will grow organically, and it will most importantly stimulate innovation between the parties. Gone are the days where you can, a 10-year contract, and you can put your hand on everything that's going to happen throughout the life of that agreement. Much more important is to instill in that agreement, into that agile agreement, the mechanisms that support innovation. That in itself can drive material benefits to both parties, and as a supplier, that's how we make money. That's a good thing. So, but to the risks themselves, uncertainty certainly is one. There's a continued variability in the market. So, you can mitigate some of these risks by load balancing, playing regions off against each other. So from a global operation, you can afford to invest in a particular region to stimulate greater demand, whereas you continue to sell actively in a different region and balance one against the other. So certainly uncertainty is a key risk that needs to be managed and mitigated to the extent that you can. Certainly the variability in the, and it's not necessarily the quality, but certainly the approaches of organizations. Those that are members of the IACCM tend to come with a different approach to contracting. They've drunk the Kool-Aid. They understand the benefits of principled negotiation. They understand how Agile can really drive material benefits to their own organization. And they come with a different mindset. Now, if you come with a more, let's say, traditional win-lose approach, then agile contracting is not really on the table. They don't go together. Yeah. And so we can start into that environment, but it's a different engagement.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, it brings us really nicely on to the other element of our discussion today, which is collaboration and collaborative contracts. And of course, Tim, I think it goes without saying that collaboration is a key element of, and absolutely to what Paul just said, if you've got a win-lose mentality, then Agile is not going to succeed. It's not going to work. The collaboration is absolutely at the heart of being able to have an Agile contract and follow an Agile contracting process.
Yeah, it is. I think the interesting point that's coming out here is there's a growing percentage of the business we do needs to be Agile, whether or not you're particularly thinking of it in the context of an Agile contract. So we know from our other data that we receive that, for example, the frequency with which people are buying services as opposed to goods is dramatically increasing. And we see that at a social level as well as a business level, with a phenomenal shift in the percentage of acquisitions that are now services. Now, if you think about it, a service by its nature is typically longer term. You don't just go to a store and buy something, bring it home and put it to use. Now you're actually buying a longer term service, which may involve that product, but you don't ever necessarily own it. So when you're moving into that type of world, then the points that Paul was making about uncertainty and volatility, etc., changing needs and requirements, means that just about every arrangement we get into, if it's going to work well, needs to have flexibility.
Yeah.
The problem for a customer in that, and Paul's touched on the problems for a supplier, but of course the problem for a customer is that they often then feel, oh my God, I'm going to be taken advantage of. If I need this service ongoing and I'm stuck with this particular supplier, they're going to take advantage of me. And I bought something that seemed quite a reasonable price at the time, but oh my God, look at all the add-ons. A bit like your experience with car rentals. So as we look at that environment, there are obviously a lot of risks, and Paul started to touch on this. One of the fundamental risks is really that of compatibility of culture.
Yeah.
And so one of the first things organizations have to do, and we as individuals need to do in this more agile world, is pay more attention to the suitability of the party that we are getting into bed with. Are they really suited? And do we have evidence? And of course, this is where we see ever-growing interest in things like the TripAdvisor model being applied in the whole business world. A lot of work going on in that area at the moment in terms of much more visibility of valid and honest recommendation. Is this a company or an organization that shows integrity? Of course, we find it's even happening with Uber, but in the other direction.
Absolutely.
Where customers are getting rated by the Uber drivers, so an Uber driver can decide, do I really want them as a customer? And I think that's a phenomenally powerful move. And, I don't know about you, Paul, but it seems to me that if suppliers started to become a lot more selective about who they did business with, we'd start to see some real shifts of behavior.
Absolutely, yeah. It's basically a shifting balance. Totally agree. I think the changing nature of certainly in the business that I work, the changing nature of the services is also playing a key role. Because we are now moving into software-defined networks, where the periphery of the network can be tweaked by a number of value-added resellers of services. So the provider of that infrastructure, BT in this case, we focus on making sure that that's available and reliable and secure and all the rest of it. And we have an arrangement with the customer to facilitate that. But also these other players are offering services into that defined network that revolutionize how the technology is delivered. That can happen in near real time. So, the ability to consume the services, try before you buy, all these sorts of things are really driving that innovation. So it is a combination of the collaborative nature of the engagement, but it's also the changing nature of the services that we offer, I think. So those two are sort of coming together to really create a new and exciting environment in which to contract. Absolutely. And again, the ability to have a quality capability to interface with the customer, to put in those services, to do that service on demand, software as a service sort of engagement. That's a key differentiator, certainly in our marketplace.
Well, and I think, of course, technology, again, it just comes to the fore in terms of its critical nature, driving that transparency of data sharing across organizations, because again, how can you possibly be agile and collaborative unless you have that technology in place to provide comfort? And I think, Paul, touching on what Tim said, he talked about the fear of the customer in this environment. How else? I mean, technology is a way of trying to allay those fears. What other experience do you have in that sort of environment where you're, essentially trying to assuage the fears of a potential customer?
I think in that engagement, it's really around, as Tim highlighted himself, it's around the relationship. You know, you negotiate and you operate with integrity, right? That is one of the most important things to do, and do that consistently, so that your reputation precedes you. You know, if you can provide case studies of application where it went well, you know, customers are our best advocates. So we track, you know, as I know IACCM do, the net promoter scores that come out from our customer base as we continue to improve the brand. These are key measures to drive that sort of engagement, and a sort of litmus test of how the brand recognition and the customer relationship is developing. So it goes back to good business performance, you know, performing with integrity, ensuring that your internal and external governance mechanisms are first rate, and that you do what you say you do. You know, none of that's rocket science. It's just, you know, being a good corporate agent.
Well, you raise a really important point, Paul, and one that I love, and Tim, you talk about it as well, the contract being about brand image. And we so often forget this, and I will always remember your story of working with Lou Gerstner at IBM, and his approach that, you know, absolutely contract terms need to reflect the brand image of the organization. But very often we make promises on the one hand, and then our terms and conditions say something completely different. Again, that's not going to drive very much of a collaborative relationship.
No, I think, and it gets, the legal profession correctly has a view of its role in protecting assets. And certainly when you come to a large corporation like a BT or an IBM, or you know, even obviously smaller companies that are rich in terms of their intellectual property or whatever, you do, of course, have to be cautious that you don't lose your core assets. So there is a degree, without any question, that the contract has a role in protecting assets. I think it's when it becomes either overprotective or exclusively protective that it becomes a problem. And I think this is where the collaborative element comes in. Because in many of these more complex engagements, and given the fact that many of the relationships are in fact virtual or semi-virtual, there is also this question of how do we actually structure a shared understanding of what collaboration is going to involve. And I think, you know, there is, again, a tendency in some organizations, particularly larger ones, to say, oh yeah, we're collaborative, and here's the rule book of how it's going to be done, which is not all that effective. I mean, I know I've tried that with you. And,
doesn't work.
So there has to be a mutuality here. So the collaborative mechanism, we've actually touched on a number of them. It's the critical role that communications plays. How are we going to communicate? What are the mechanisms? How do I make communication easy? Today, if I find a business is closed at the weekend, it drives me crazy. What do you mean you're closed at the weekend? I'm working all through the weekend. I expect you to be available and accessible. Now, you know, I go to an extreme there. I do appreciate that some businesses validly close at the weekend, but nonetheless, it's becoming the exception.
Yeah.
I want people accessible. I mean, I'm working pretty solidly a lot of the hours, but certainly, you know, 9 to 5, I'm going to be really busy. So a business that, you know, I call up and they tell me, sorry, we'll close at 5 o'clock, is a useless business to me. So we need to think about issues of communication, the needs of our counterparty. We need to think about another thing you mentioned, when is joint working necessary? If it's a complex project, there's a high probability that having some level of joined up activity between the resources will be really helpful. We'll build that shared spirit, making sure that we've got a common and consistent goal, that both of us have the same view of what we're trying to achieve is pretty important too. And it sounds ridiculous, but of course we know from our research that failing to actively agree common scope and goals is the #1 source of failure.
Yeah.
So there's a whole list, and you know them, of things that our research have told us, and they are featured, I think, in the MOOC. There are a number of things that we've identified that are critical components of building real collaboration, and certainly the contracts and the relationships which use those principles are consistently managing to generate much better results.
Yeah. So just a reminder to all of those of you listening, if you do have any questions, then please do post them. As I said, it can be in the comment section of the STEP, live in the YouTube chat, or on Twitter as well, using the hashtag FLContracts. Amanda Thompson, thank you for your question. I think an element of it I've posed already. You add a final point, which is what commercial terms should not be agile. Query, we always have to be careful what we mean by commercial terms versus legal terms. But I think principally, Tim, when you enter into an agile contract, in fact, your desire, I'm sure, is for longer term engagement, but many of the commercial terms can indeed themselves be agile. And I think what's underestimated by people is that approaching your relationship and a project with an agile mindset actually can drive, and should indeed, done successfully, drive really long-term engagements, long-term and successful engagements.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So well done, Amanda, for asking it. It's got us pondering. But I think you're broadly right. I mean, in the sense that, is there anything that is not completely non-negotiable? Now, agile doesn't necessarily mean that it absolutely, in fact, does not mean that it's sort of woolly and vague. No. It's really a matter of what greater clarity over how you're going to manage flexibility and uncertainty. And as I mentioned, often in creating milestones, for instance, along a development cycle, you may very consciously recognize that at those milestones, there could be a need for quite extensive renegotiation. And I was just trying to think about, well, what wouldn't you renegotiate? And I'm not sure that there's anything that you wouldn't consider potential for renegotiation, but there are obviously some things that you would be less inclined to. But it's almost, I suppose, Amanda, it's a bit like thinking through, have you got any real red lines? Yeah. Yes, I want to be paid. But on the other hand, maybe I'm ready to be flexible over exactly when I'm paid or how I'm paid, or where I'm paid.
Yeah.
Totally agree. And we've had some success in this space by really identifying in advance, the standard terms and conditions, the things that are, basically that are an integral part of the product, the features. So to change something in that would require, say, development or something that would be out of the ordinary. So we can change those, but it's going to take longer, it's going to cost more, and undoubtedly extend the negotiation cycle. So unless you've got a real issue, let's park those. And there's a much smaller set of things that we do negotiate as a standard way of operating. So I think it's a combination. The contract, the agile nature of the contract is an important part, combined with that relationship and the going into the negotiation with that mindset. I think those two things are key success factors, if you like.
I think that's right. And we're coming up to the close of our half hour. I think we've probably bamboozled quite a few people today, because the questions haven't been flying in as thick and fast as they normally would do. I think what we'll do now is just some concluding thoughts really for the audience, and I'll come to you both. I think from my perspective, mindset, as you rightly say, Paul, is a really key component of this approach. That there needs to be appropriate governance, but you have to be able to approach agility with that appropriate mindset and belief in your counterparty, that they have that same mindset and share the same ethics and integrity. Paul, I don't know, do you have some concluding thoughts for everyone?
Yeah. So certainly business integrity is a key part of this. The contract form that supports this agile contracting is obviously key. We touched on risk management, so being aware of what risks are brought to the table and what mitigations you can put in place. And let's not forget the real importance of doing that post-contract management that enables us to continue to delight, and most importantly, drive innovation into the relationship that keeps the pot boiling. Yep. That's how you develop that collaboration, because you know, it doesn't happen all together. You collaborate a little bit, and then that's great. Do a bit more. That's great. Your team. That's great, and relationship grows from there.
I like the concept of continuing to delight, Paul. That's that's not one we often hear in a business-to-business environment, but
exactly, that's really important.
Absolutely, Tim.
Yeah, and I think it was in a sense related to that point that I was thinking of my final comment. I think Agile and collaborative is not just something we do in order to be nice. It's something we do because it's absolutely in a business's interest to do it. In today's environment, I think a failure to be agile and collaborative is going to be, in most cases, the the beginning of a relatively rapid death.
Yeah.
It's not an option any longer. But nonetheless, it is challenging, and it's a phenomenal opportunity for anybody really involved in the commercial world, because it does require significant redesign of internal measurement and management systems and a lot of the principles that we've typically used in contracting.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tim, for joining us today. I hope it's been inspiring for all of you, interesting, and of course, if you do have any questions that you'd like to pose to us, then you can do so after the event. We're always delighted to hear from you. There is a plethora of material resource on the IACCM website that deals with agile and collaborative contracts, so you do feel free to go and access that resource. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week. Tim and I will be with you next week, where we are tackling, as Tim said before, the topic of contract standards and automated negotiation. So it'll be fun. Looking forward to seeing you all. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Paul.
Yes, interesting discussion. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.